won't be long. Not here, not now. I have to get back there. The bet was rigged. He made me believe. Now, there's darkness in my soul. I want to podcast again.
Perfect. Welcome everybody to Spawnography number 1. I'm your host, Pierce Lyden with...
Oh, I'm George Marston.
Oh boy, what a way to kick things off. Welcome back to podcasting, George.
Yeah, same to you, Pierce. Same to you. It's the first show I've done since our last.
Yeah, it's been a while. 5 years? 6 years?
Too long. Time is
for new listeners
at this point. Like, as for Spawn, time for us is meaningless and eternal.
Yeah. For new listeners, George and I used to do a show called Comics Will Break Your Heart. This was a few years ago. And that was about whatever comics our guests wanted to speak about. We didn't really get to choose unless we got to pick them for ourselves. It was about comics that really mean a lot to you.
Yeah, I think this kind of takes it back sort of to those themes, because this is certainly a comic book that influenced, I think I can say for both of us, our childhoods, and certainly the comic industry of our childhoods. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Spawn has loomed large over our entire lives, which is pretty
not
funny.
Just Spawn, but his creator, Todd McFarlane, the Todd Father himself. If there's one thing that you can say about Todd McFarlane, besides the fact that he is a comic book artist, it's that he is a disruptor. I said that with such gravitas, thinking it was going to be funny. Anyway, but yeah, no, seriously though, his whole thing was that he just disrupted a lot of parts of the comic book industry and other industries, and boy, that sure is tied into the story of Spawn as a comic book and as a character.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, also, why should anybody care about us talking about comic books? I would say we're not just fans. I would call ourselves professionals. Maybe not on the level of Mr. McFarlane, but
I'm
where are you coming from, George?
Industry. Well, so you can read my writing every day on the website newsarama.com. That's been the case since 2009 when I started doing reviews, and now I am basically just writing my little fingies off over there, covering news and other personal angles on comics. And this is also a personal angle that is totally separate from that. So just there's my these views are not endorsed by whomever disclaimer. But yes, I'm a writer for Newsarama. I've been with them since 2009, and that's pretty much where you can read my writing at all times.
Cool. I wrote with you for a while. I still do sometimes.
Yes.
I got started in Newsarama in 2012 and doing reviews as well, and have since done many top 10 reviews or top 10 kind of lists and interviews and Comic-Con coverage and reviews of Joaquin Phoenix's The Joker. That people on the internet got mad about. Also written at Popverse.
What? People on the internet had opinions about a Joker thing?
Yeah, surprisingly. Also written at Popverse, written at Comics XF. Is that it? I think that's it. Oh, and I started Kaboom.com back in the day, back in those halcyon days of 2011. The concept here is,
just like Todd McFarlane, we're going to do all of Spawn.
Yeah, for better or for worse. In terms of like overall personal impact, I mean, Spawn was always something for me that when I was growing up, you just knew about it. Like as soon as I was old enough to know like that other kids thought things were cool, I was like, oh, Spawn, right? Because I'm 35. Spawn comes out in 1992. I'm 4 years old, so I don't know about it quite yet. But by the time I'm like in school and other kids are reading comics, and I was reading Spider-Man and Marvel comics because my dad had them. Spawn was the guy that looked like Spider-Man but had a cape like Batman, and I had no idea what all those chains were for. But I was, 6 or 7, and I was just like, yeah, obviously this is the coolest guy, but he's a little scary. And all the kids that read his book are much 90s edgier than me.
So for me, I'm a little older than you, of course. I'm 40 years old. And so when Spawn came out, I was 9, 10 years old. And I was aware of Spawn and Image Comics in general. We'll get into that a little bit. But I had been reading comics since since I could hold things in my hand. My dad was putting comics in them. So I was aware of Spawn, and I remember very specifically seeing the posters going up all over the stores, the comic stores that I would go to alongside, Wildcats. I remember Wildcats very vividly because I thought, of course, because they were drawn by Jim Lee, that they looked like the X-Men, but like a more different, more cooler X-Men in a way. Target audience reached, I guess. But Spawn for me really came into view a few years later, when he was a little more popular because of the toy line. And of course, that toy line came with the comics, and that's when I first read Spawn #1 and started actually reading some of these back issues and seeing and noticing more about Spawn comics in, Wizard Magazine and at comic stores, and seeing it on shelves and kind of noticing it really in a strong way for the first time.
When you started your first pull list at comic shops, like I didn't really start collecting like that until I was 17 years old, 18 years old. So before that, I was like, oh, I got my allowance and I'd go to the comic book shop, but I'd go buy Marvel books because they were characters I already knew,
Yeah.
and I love Spider-Man and the X-Men and Ghost Rider and whatever. And Spawn and Image, I had some of those books. I had Shadowhawk #1, Brigade #1, Youngbloods, Wildcats, of course, and I watched the Wildcats show, Savage Dragon.
Yeah.
But Spawn, I think my dad, because, with the 90s comic boom of like, oh, buy Death of Superman and your kid will go to college. Uh, my
Somebody's
dad
kid
would
did.
go to the store and look for his issues of like, Cap or Thor that he needed to fill out his collection, but then he'd just go buy #1s. And so I had all these books kind of except for Spawn. Was Spawn something that like, once it caught your attention, you were old enough to have your own pull list, you were like, oh, I'm putting that on my list?
Well, funny enough, by the time I had a pull list, I was kind of the same deal as you. I didn't have a pull list till I was in high school, and my original pull list was very dorky, very, very vanilla. I wasn't collecting Spawn at that point, but what was weirdly got me into Spawn, and this is very funny, like got me into current Spawn comics, was when I was like 11 or 12, a few years after it had come out. I had a babysitter who had some Spawn comics, and she showed them to me, and I was like, oh, this is what fucking Spawn is. This is like nothing, like, Sam and Twitch in their like weird noir adventures alongside Spawn and stuff like that. It was just a very strange kind of comic, different from the very middle of the road vanilla kind of superhero fare that I love and generally have loved. So I started reading Spawn in back issues and maybe probably like one of the first versions of the trades. I would get the comics sporadically here and there, but most of the time, up until I was, again, probably close to 15, 16 years old, the same way you were, I was buying comics based on whichever one had the coolest characters on the cover, or whichever one was in the grocery store that week, or whatever. So
100%.
the ones that would get my attention for Spawn would be the ones that had really distinct art, really interesting covers. That's how I saw a lot of, Greg Capullo. So the art would really catch my eye, and I was into just like a lot of the really weird, eccentric art that would go into some of those comics. And the other thing was, I was huge on collecting the Spawn toys. Like, I loved the Spawn action figure line. And that's also how I got to know, Todd McFarlane, because you'd see his face on those things, and you'd see, like, I think I had a VHS tape of some of the HBO cartoon, and he did the intro to those, which always stuck with me. And
We'll
that's
cover those at some point because they are
very
glorious.
interesting. Yes. From there, I started recognizing and connecting him back to the Spider-Man comics that I had bought as a kid, Spider-Man #1 and his Amazing Spider-Man run and stuff like that, that were some of my favorites as a young kid. And so it kind of became this interesting sort of realization and deeper understanding of some of my own taste in comics and how the Todd father, Todd McFarlane, had kind of shaped my own taste along with the industries.
There are a lot of things too. Spider-Man is the first thing of his that I run into as a kid, and it's because Spider-Man's on the cover, so I bought it. And the covers look cool. Obviously, the iconic Spider-Man #1. I think still the highest selling comic by a writer-artist at
I
like
think so.
2.5 million copies.
Yeah,
Which
I
is
think
insane to
you
think
might be
about.
right.
And yeah, I mean,
Oh,
it's
hold
pretty
on.
insane to think about. I think Spawn doesn't come quite that high. Spawn #1's 1.7 million, I believe. But
Yeah,
to have two books underneath, under your belt that are that massive, I understand it was the time for it, but wow, that's not any small feat. And also the fact that with Spider-Man especially changed the iconography of this character that had been around for almost 30 years at that point, where we draw webs different now.
yeah, draws
You
eyes
know,
different. And interestingly enough, that is both the key to Todd McFarlane's massive popularity and the key to the eventual publication of Spawn through Image Comics, because Marvel hated the way he drew Spider-Man. They hated it. The editors hated it. They were coming out of the Jim Shooter era that was very house style focused. Very much there was a Jim Shooter formula and a Jim Shooter Marvel method. And there was a version of Spider-Man that was Marvel's Spider-Man, and you drew him that way. And the late 80s, early 90s is where artists like the artists that would eventually go on to found Image Comics, and we'll touch on that a little bit. That is where they started to break out of that house style and started to find ways to put more of their own personality. Marvel hated that Todd McFarlane was breaking Spider-Man's. I almost called him Spawn, and that's funny. Breaking Spider-Man's house style, but they couldn't stop him because it was selling millions of freaking copies, So that did eventually lead to the actual publication of Spawn, because Todd McFarlane wanted the creative control more than he wanted to draw Spider-Man.
yeah. And I think also too, and he's kind of said as much in a few interviews, it's he didn't really have anything else to do with Spider-Man, right? He already had the biggest comic that he could make by himself under his belt. And then, like you said, it was kind of a push and pull with what that character needed to be for a corporation to continue to put it out. And the fact that if you go back and read his Spider-Man, it's definitely super weird compared to what was going on at the time. I know Clone Saga stuff is happening, but he has this it is a little bit like a test run for what Spawn would become. And he said I didn't write comics at the time, so I didn't really know what I was doing.
I think that Spawn is such an interesting artifact.
Spawn's had its own resurgence. Todd McFarlane has had a resurgence. And it's interesting to kind of highlight the road to how we got here.
Yeah, I mean, now it'll be with Spawn 301, it's the highest selling indie creator owned book of all time.
Yeah.
We're almost at 350. And it's almost like part of that is an exploration of this man who I think is stubborn as hell, and I respect him for it, but
it also is stubbornness has cost him a lot, and I think that's another thing that makes him kind of one of those great, almost a literary character in himself. Todd McFarlane is a character in the comic industry as much as Spawn is a character in comic books.
Yeah, the two have become inseparable in a way that I think with other characters, even though like any other comic book character, they many creators have worked on Spawn, other writers have worked on Spawn, other artists have worked on Spawn, but there's been this kind of through line where Spawn and Todd are inseparable from each other. And I don't know that you can really say that about any other creator. Like, obviously, when you think of Stan Lee, you think of Spider-Man and you think of the X-Men and you think of, so many different characters, Fantastic Four. But I think also, depending on who you're talking to, maybe Stan's not exactly who you think of. And with Spawn, I don't think that happens. I like,
There's maybe 2 or 3 other people, and their name would still come after Todd McFarlane.
Yeah, exactly. There's when you think of the X-Men, I don't necessarily think that you think of Stan or Jack, right? You think of Chris Claremont, right? And even with Chris, like, you think of so many, maybe you think of John Byrne instead, or you think of
Dave Cockrum, Jim Lee,
right?
Some of these
And
other
there's
collaborators.
This collaborative thing that exists in comics, but also
Louise
allows people
Simonson
to make their mark on these characters. The fact that, and we're going to get into this over the course of the podcast, but the fact that issue 5 is written by Alan Moore, or sorry, issue 8 is written by Alan Moore, and then it's like murderer's row of like Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Frank Miller. Later we'll get Grant Morrison,
and the story of how all of those writers came to be part of Spawn, and what the effect that had, not just on Spawn as a comic, but as an industry and a job for Todd McFarlane and on his own life and livelihood, I think is so interesting. And I think it's interesting to see that, frankly, reflected in the pages of Spawn, because Todd McFarlane interweaved his own life so inextricably in it.
Right. And it's one of those things that I don't think that you necessarily notice when you're a kid. And it was something that, to get back to like my personal journey with Spawn, is that eventually I just sort of ignored Spawn. I was like, oh, I understand. Even as I worked in the industry, I was like, I get what Spawn is. Spawn's the guy that looks like Spider-Man.
It became kind of an institution like Spider-Man or something, where if it's not what's cool to you, it becomes background noise. It's just always there.
Yeah, and like any other comic, there's 200 issues of it, and do I care to get involved with what this even is?
Apparently, we care a lot because we're doing it.
Well, so for me, I'd read Spawn issues like here and there, whatever. I don't even think I ever reviewed one for Rama in any of my time there.
It didn't get a lot of attention because it just wasn't a book that had it didn't have a lot of creative juice behind it at the time. It wasn't seen as a particularly innovative or interesting comic. It kind of became much like Spider-Man or Batman or something. Again, one of those comics where, okay, you got a Spawn issue, you pretty much know what it's going to be.
Yeah. And I think that, so for me, like I dug in the pandemic. I was like, what's a thing I've never read? And I was like, you know what? I'll read some Spawn. And I think HBO Max had just come out and all the Spawn episodes were on there too. And so I was like, I never watched this show when I was a kid. Maybe I watched like one, maybe, because it was like the R-rated show. So like, and I didn't have HBO, and I like watched it because, so I was like, it was on HBO Max, and I was like, oh, I'm going to watch it. And I was like, I should read the book. And I was partly inspired because the year before I had been at San Diego Comic-Con, and I had to cover a Todd McFarlane Spotlight panel. And my initial thought was, oh God, why? I wish I didn't have to cover this, but I have to do it for work. So I guess I'll sit here and listen to Todd McFarlane talk for an hour about whatever.
It's an interesting experience.
Well, I had covered other image creators. Specifically, I'd covered Rob Liefeld, and he had so many of the image guys that were part of Extreme Studios, like come on board and like come on stage. And it was just them kind of like talking about the old days, and it wasn't super interesting, and there was nothing to really get out of it. I covered the Todd McFarlane Spotlight panel, kind of assuming that it's going to be more of the same. And it is vastly different than that. And it turns into Todd kind of becoming a motivational speaker and kind of like giving his like outlook on life and the way that he works. And for an hour, he had a room full of people in the palm of his hand talking about, he's like, there's the top 300 comics that comes out for every month, and we get to see the sales, right? He just starts asking the crowd. He's like, how many of those books do you think are Marvel, DC, licensed, whatever? And he asked somebody like in the front row or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, I don't know, like 100 of them." And he goes, "You'd have to get through enough books that are not already licensed, are not based on a franchise, are not Marvel or DC. You're down in like the low 200s, which means all you need to do is get into that top 300. And if you're Hollywood or whatever, you're looking and trying to find the next big thing in comics, and like you're going to keep going down that list. And like if you get into that list, maybe somebody gives you a call." And it was this kind of thought that like all you have to do is kind of try. And I just saw a recent Ink Pulp podcast with Todd on it, where he's just like,
I just saw that.
where he's like, nobody gives a shit about you unless you give a shit about you. And it's, I think that you and I also, as creatives, right, making music and making comics and writing, you get in your own way so much. And this is a guy that just like wouldn't let himself get in his own way, and he wouldn't let anybody else get in his own way. And so I kind of dug into Spawn as this like amazing artifact of like what you can do if you just, it's not even confidence. It's almost just like brash stupidity and stubbornness that like he forced this thing into existence. And it's so funny to see Spawn sort of like lives in everything that he does. Something we talked about a little bit off mic.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
Is that Spawn is the story of Todd McFarlane, and Todd McFarlane is the creation of Spawn, and they've kind of become these inseparable entities that I think is so fascinating, because there are no two other characters that I could, or two other characters.
Yeah, true though.
Two sort of like stalwart parts of the comic book industry that I could say, and it's not true of any of any of the other Image founders, right? Rob doesn't have a book that you really know him for. Jim kind of did, but doesn't now because he's so entwined with DC.
Eric Larson has Savage Dragon. We'll give him that, of course. But it never reached the heights of popularity of Spawn. It was part of that 90s boom. The story of Todd McFarlane is so interesting, and the story of Spawn that goes with it is that his career in the comic industry is very much like the career of, one of the greatest baseball players of all time, to use an analogy that Todd himself would certainly love. Because you get to see him rise up through the ranks, finally get a spot on a team that really makes it all the way to the top of the league, and then into the World Series, becomes champion of the world, goes out on his own as a free agent. And Spawn is kind of like having a record of that athlete at the prime of his game, in the time when not only is his narrative forming of his life, but the narrative he's specifically creating to reflect that is right there. And it is kind of a unique and singular creation in the comic industry, like you said. And it's not to say that it's, so above and beyond artistically that it's the best or something like that, but that intertwined narrative of the creator and comic in a comic magazine that is mainstream, that is stands alongside something like Spider-Man, Batman, Superman in the eyes of the public. That's just so rare, and it's just so rare to have it inextricable from him. Like you said, you brought up Stan Lee or Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby and the Fantastic Four go hand in hand in my mind, but to other people, there are so many other generational talents that have worked on that all of those stories are someone's story. But Spawn is Todd McFarlane's story, both in terms of his creation and his life. And so, to set the stage for Spawn as we get into it, we'll get right back to we'll sum up his Spider-Man career. He reached the top of the game on Amazing Spider-Man, managed to get his own spin-off where he said, let me just write it. That writing part didn't necessarily work out for him, and we'll get into that as we talk about Spawn, because it's an important aspect of the history of Spawn and why it is the way it is. But he still made it to the top of the industry, and at the top of his game, and at the top of the game of several other artists, Jim Lee, Jim Valentino, Mark Silvestri, thank you. Rob Liefeld.
Cyberforce, baby. That's the next podcast after we finish this one.
Honestly, dude, I'm here for it. Silvestri's the nicest fucking guy. But they all left Marvel at the height of their popularity, so we're taking our ball and we're taking it to our own court. Because Todd McFarlane, who, gotta give it up to him, wanted there to be a comics union from very early in his career, decided to bring along the top talents in the industry and say, take your ball and play with it however you want. Create your own characters. We don't need the X-Men. We don't need Spider-Man. We just need our talent because that is what is selling these books. Spider-Man is selling 1 million copies because Todd McFarlane is drawing it.
Yeah, and it's, in a way, too, he made the big two the big three. We can't talk about comics without talking about Image Comics. We can't talk about creator-owned comics without talking about Image Comics. There wouldn't be so many, for folks who are fans of The Walking Dead or Invincible, that doesn't exist at all. It can't. The industry wasn't set up to allow that to exist because, yes, you had, and it's funny that early Image, Malibu Comics is the one that's really helping distribute them because
I
they're...
love Malibu Comics.
Yeah,
the Ultraverse. The saddest pain of my life is that they'll never come back. Anyway,
but
that's
like,
a third podcast for another day.
There's Malibu, and there's, I know Epic's the Marvel imprint, and there's all these small companies, and we got Mirage, right? And the Ninja Turtles end up being kind of the thing that is similar to Spawn in a way.
Very much the prototypical, that is the much more Hollywood writ large version of the Spawn story, even. Is that...
And it's funny because it only happens first book comes out in 84. They got a movie by 90. First Spawn book comes out in 92. He's got a movie by 97. He beats them by just a year, takes them 6 years, takes him 5. And there's a line in this arc about the Turtles.
Yeah.
So I think it's definitely something he thought about, and
that's true. It has to be. He's such a competitive person. We were joking about this before that, there's an alternate universe where he led the Toronto Blue Jays to the World Series in 1987 instead of breaking his foot or whatever it was and starting to draw comics.
Yeah. So let's get into Todd specifically outside of comics, right? He's born in 1961. He is from Canada. His dad runs a printing press in Calgary. And the idea initially was that he was going to go into dad's business, right? He gets into comics at an early age, relatively. I
think he said it was 16 or 17 high school age.
Actually, not unlike the two of us in a way. But that he was like, oh, it's cool that I like comics, but I'm going to be a baseball player. I'm going to be a baseball player that likes comics. And he would draw his own stuff. But the fallback plan was always, hey, I don't have enough money to go to Gonzaga, so I'm going to go to a smaller school. He gets a scholarship, breaks his foot, decides maybe I'll do this drawing thing. Maybe I'll give that a shot. And doesn't have to go home to the printing press, but does keep living in Canada.
Yes, stays in Canada with his wife, Wanda, who, not his wife yet. I forget when they married, probably early 80s or late 70s, but Todd McFarlane is an eternal wife guy, much like Al Simmons, a.k.a. Spawn, and that is endemic to the mythology of both Spawn and Todd McFarlane, is that his wife, Wanda, co-created Spawn with him in a way, she helped him with the early treatments of the Spawn comic that he created in his late teens, and he credits her with being alongside him every step of the way. The only time you'll ever see Todd McFarlane get emotional outside of excitement or frustration is he will tear up talking about his wife every time. And that's Todd McFarlane, wife guy, created Spawn, wife demon.
And like we were saying before, it's that's part of why you can't separate him and Al. They are.
He named Spawn's family after his own family. Yeah, we'll get into it. He does that a lot. It's important.
In this episode, we are going to get into the first arc of Spawn. That is Questions, which is probably the most.
I have them.
Yeah, it's the most on point name for an arc of a comic book I've maybe ever read.
Because most of it consists of Spawn asking himself fucking questions. A lot of Spawn standing in dramatic poses and going, I have to remember my wife. I have to find my wife.
which he will.
And his questions answered.
So we get, as far as a creative team, pretty much the same creative team throughout. So obviously, it's going to be story pencils and inks by Todd McFarlane, letters by Tom Orzechowski, an all-time great as well. Colors by Steve Oliff with some assists by, I think it's in issue 3. No, in issue 2 by Ruben Rude and Ollie Optics.
Yeah.
And his wife, Wanda, edits the first 3 issues.
Yeah.
As well. And then we get a new editor on issue 4, Terry Fitzgerald. And every one of these issues, a lot of the early issues of Spawn have a different dedication. Issue 1, we'll start where it all began. Issue 1's dedicated to Jack Kirby.
I mean, God bless it. I love the dedication.
I think that's the other thing about it, is that what Todd was doing is never about, like, the spin-off to Image Comics is not an ego thing. It is it's like him understanding that there were creators before him who weren't able to get what they needed out of the companies that they work for, but they were not in a position really to organize and to kind of break off onto their own.
Self-publishing, yeah.
Right. And we do see that a bit over the years, right? We see Steve Ditko kind of do his own thing, and we see other creators kind of go off and do their own thing in whatever version that is, but they don't reach like the heights of success that Image does. And that's arguably because they didn't reach the heights of success that the Image guys did when they broke out, right?
Right.
It would be a different story for Jack Kirby to like leave Marvel right after Fantastic Four number 12 or whatever and be like, now figure it out. But even still, the industry wasn't really set up, and it's kind of this perfect storm moment that Image gets to exist. This issue is so indebted. I wouldn't say it's that indebted to Jack in its execution, but I think in its spirit, it absolutely is.
Definitely, because Jack Kirby's kind of whole thing was to create your own mythology and your own mythos and just go with it. He had an unlimited imagination in his head, and his whole philosophy was to get all of that out as much as he could. And I think that that's something that Todd McFarlane is definitely channeling here, is saying, well, let this be my creation. Let it be the creation that I have wanted to make and thought about making since I was a teenager, since I first got into comics and started drawing. And as we'll see in these first issues, the visual language that Todd McFarlane puts into Spawn, where there's a lot of abstraction, both in Spawn's physical form and the forms of his cape, the way his chains work, and also the panel and page layouts that are sometimes wildly bizarre and artistically focused. I think that's him saying, I'm going to throw all the kitchen sink in there and taking all these tools that he had been developing since his early break-in in the comic industry on Infinity Inc. And if you go back and look at some of those Infinity Inc. pages, they look more like Spawn pages to me in some cases than some of the work he was doing right before this, because he was experimenting so much with layout and with the way he focused characters and panels. So yeah, I think the Jack Kirby in spirit, I think it's him saying, let this be all the things that I've wanted to do, that I've been shoehorning into these comics, let that be the visual language of Spawn. And that gets in right from the jump.
Yeah, and I think, he is definitely a creator who wears his influences on his sleeves. There's no point at which I don't kind of know what he's referencing when he does things, even though he is somebody who, as we said before, like for Spider-Man specifically, I think really changes the game in terms of what that character's iconography is in a lot of ways. But when we go, this first page where we're out in space looking at Earth, right? It doesn't not feel like a Jack Kirby kind of space thing at the beginning of an issue, or a Jim Starlin. And then as we move into these like very static grids, which is not really what Todd's known for doing, we'll get to the Frank Miller page, the Frank Miller talking heads, but the explanation of the origin that Spawn is sort of like misremembering, or so he's got this like selective memory going on where he sees flashes of his past. On one hand, I have to imagine that if you're picking this up in 1992, this seems like, oh my God, what is this? Right? Like, this looks
You're
like a
asking
comic
the
that I know,
question. Yeah,
but
exactly.
it's like, wow, like what is this? It's these like glimpses of something that you just don't quite understand. And it's easy then to be on Spawn's side because you're kind of right there with him. But as soon as we get through that origin, and he says like, all I could think of was her, so I promised and he accepted, all because of her, when he's talking about the deal that he makes to basically come back. Then we get a page that is, to me, extremely Todd McFarlane.
Yes.
We get this, like, the panels kind of that we've sort of seen before, like floating down the page. We get a huge cityscape.
Spawn mostly in silhouette.
Yeah, blending into this background. The cape is there. And then we get the power meter and the hourglass and some solid Orzechowski lettering too, which is always really, really fun, into a page turn and a pinup, basically. I mean, if I have one knock against Todd when he writes and draws, it's that you can kind of tell where he didn't necessarily run out of time, but he was like, well, I could just like draw one image and it kind of works.
Yeah. Sometimes, honestly, I think that's just what he wanted to draw. He was criticized early in his career for using too many splash pages, and a lot of editor's notes that he got told him to pull back on it. So I think he just loves drawing those big, striking images. But also, you're right. He thought, I can draw one big-ass frickin' Spawn. So we kind of skipped a little bit over the talking heads, which I think is funny because while Spawn is musing over what his existence is supposed to mean, who the hell even is he, who is the her that he's trying to get back to, who did he make a deal with, we get this rundown of a situation that's happening in real life in the news about a world-famous government assassin named Al Simmons, whose highly publicized death has become a subject of media. Now, I do want to point out that being a world-famous assassin feels like the worst guy for the job. It's like James Bond introducing himself to everyone he meets by his actual name.
Yeah, it says like he's honored by the president and vice president, as well as hundreds of officers of all of the armed services. So it wasn't even like there was any infighting. All the armed services respected
him. The thin blue line held for Spawn.
Well, in this, I guess it would be a green line.
Yeah, whatever.
Because of, I don't know, it's like a joke about his eyes
all the
being
armed
green.
Services. Yeah, no, fair enough. But so the premise there is that, like we said, Al Simmons is dead, and we don't exactly know how. His what widow, Wanda Blake, is mourning him, and people just have opinions about what she's wearing, about whether Al Simmons' death is a government cover-up. Spoiler
Which means
alert.
She's a little bit famous too, then, right?
Apparently so. They are like a society couple. It's like if the fucking American Sniper guy went to the Met Gala.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good way to put it. And also, I do like that we get 3 different channels, right? We get CNN just delivering us the news. We get My View on 2, which is like, I guess, sort of the equivalent is like Fox News.
The conspiracy sort of tinge.
The conspiracy.
Yeah, very reactionary perspective.
And then we get an attempt at writing the first queer character in Spawn, the entertainment reporter.
It's a very deep reading of this character. And honestly, probably exactly what Todd McFarlane was thinking, because he definitely is writing in archetypes through all of this. Like, he is writing in, some would say stereotypes at points, but very much archetypal, like husband, wife, soldier, gay entertainment reporter. these very Jungian archetypes that we all recognize.
The thing that's kind of fun about it, though, is I do think that it allows him to use those archetypes to start to say something. And one of the things that I've noticed about Spawn, because Al is, ex-military, is that there is, it's unclear whether or not the political messaging of the book is incidental because the power that be that is like that worked against Spawn just happened to be the military. So in this case, Todd writes about Al hating the military because they have sort of done this to him, not unlike Todd's powers that be being like Marvel Comics. Like,
Yes.
is he just bucking against whatever the authority is, and in this case it just happens to be the military, or does he actually not like the military? We do also know that Al is maybe not a Republican, but he and Wanda met at the Republican convention.
Yes. That is one of those early 90s to early 2000s comic book conventions where especially a lot of like quote unquote liberal comic writers, and you'll see this in characters like the Great Machine in Ex Machina, will be like, actually my hero's Republican. So whatever I say, it's tempered with this very centrist, but not a politically centrist, but lowest common denominator viewpoint of what can sell a comic book in Todd McFarlane's eyes. And I think some of it is, like you suggested, somewhat ego based. And I think the idea of an ego driven hero is important to Todd McFarlane because also Spawn's ego drives the literal narrative and narration of the book. It's his point of view. So that is what we know as a hero to Todd McFarlane, as a guy who would give up everything to A, reunite with his wife, and 2, hunt down the people who separated them to begin with.
Yeah, but I wonder then too if even his sort of like, as we dive kind of deeper into this, do we think that even his sort of criticism of any sort of authority is really shallow and just, I want to do what I want and I want the things that I want because that is more archetypical? Because I think the thing that we're also going to see more as other creators start to involve themselves with Spawn is that they don't really seem to be interested in the same things. Todd has gone on record as saying like he doesn't particularly like Doctor Strange. He's not interested by Doctor Strange. However, he made a guy with a big ass red cape who fights demons and stuff. Like,
yeah,
that's not Doctor Strange in a way.
Well, and there's we can kind of dissect some of those elements of Spawn because one thing that's endemic to Spawn, and really quick before I say anything else, I do just want to call back to highlighting the work of Tom Orzechowski on this because as I'm looking at these pages, his lettering, it's like he thought to himself, even if this script is not interesting to read, it will be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
And decided to make it engaging just through how he engages with Todd McFarlane's panel layouts, how he engages the lettering in terms of like the character's state of mind. It's A+ work in a title that's kind of full of people doing their best version of their best. That's something that is kind of part of the magic of this, is sort of the unsung work of Tom Orzechowski in a very big and sincere way, because also a lot of this lettering that he does here will find its way into things like McFarlane Toys branding and the further, graphical language of Spawn through the years, just as this first issue shows, the big striking silhouettes and the strange sort of puzzle piece layouts, and of course the ticking clock that is the measure of Spawn's powers. That visual dynamism that's created by Orzechowski's lettering throughout these pages becomes, again, the graphical language of Spawn through the years, and of Todd McFarlane's larger endeavors.
I mean, Orzechowski, his longest collaborator.
Yeah.
Outside of his wife.
Outside of his wife. And so as we get deeper into the story here, we see Spawn beating people up, but we learn that some of these people that are being there's a B plot here. I'm sorry, I'm getting tongue tied. There's a B plot here where we see 2 detectives and we meet them for the first time. Sam and Twitch are kind of the, again, archetypal like big guy, little guy, tough guy, small guy, good cop, bad cop, almost Penn and Teller-esque in a way kind of characters. They're investigating a series of brutal murders. So as we're learning that, we're also seeing Spawn engaging in some brutal fights with guys who are trying to assault a woman, and he says, it has some of my favorite Spawn dialogue in it, where he says, "You needn't be afraid." And then, the other thing that happens here that I think is interesting is we see the other thing that is the hallmark of what Spawn does in the first arc of Spawn Questions, which is he says to himself, "Who is my wife? I have to find my wife." And then the other thing he does is he passes out anytime he does anything interesting. So like he stops this assault on this woman, and as he's trying to comfort her, he goes hug and has a very strange like dream sequence page where he sees Wanda's face, and he comes to sobbing in this woman's arms.
Which also, and this is kind of where I'm going to call out again that, I understand why there would be only one image that Spawn has in his head of Wanda. Like, I get it from a conceptual standpoint. I also get it from like a saving a lot of time standpoint.
You learn a lot of Xeroxing techniques when your dad owns a print shop.
We've seen this one image of Wanda with her eyes closed since like page 3. I think it's pretty much the same one.
But in a way, that's also kind of cinematic because it's definitely him taking that action movie cliche of when you see like
the flashback
flashback, or like the guy watching the footage of his wife and it's all gauzy and she's like, "Oh, why are you filming while I'm doing something cute?"
I do think that this page,
but she is mourning at his funeral, so it's a little different.
But I do also think that where I think the Sam and Twitch page is so well laid out in the sense that you're sort of like, oh, we're in for something different, right? And their colors are different. And as a reader, it does a good job of being like, hey, this is a different thing to pay attention to. They're not going to run into Spawn right now. Don't worry about it.
They don't have that green haze that kind of follows Spawn around in terms of the coloring scheme.
But this page where he remembers his funeral is a mess. And I think that, like, again, I understand his like fractured mind. There don't really need to be Spider-Man webs here.
No, and I mean, I guess that's the cobwebs of your memory, I guess. But it's him kind of throwing in a little bit of what he does best, which is that spaghetti webbing. And then also, again, going back to those page layouts he did in Infinity Incorporated, they're very oftentimes conceptual like this, very surrealist with like elements that float over the page, like the way Spawn's mask is broken up. It almost looks like a graphical, like a clothing symbol or something, like an Adidas mark. But we get more talking heads. We get more Spawn creeping in an alley going, "What am I? Who am I? What the?"
We do also get the update that it is 5 years later.
Yes.
And there's
true.
a lot of stuff that
by accident
in the storytelling. So earlier I was saying like, well, it's kind of cool that like Al doesn't know anything. And we as a reader we're reading this new issue for the first time. We end up learning like a lot more than Al. And again, the talking heads, while I get the reference to Dark Knight Returns and sort of Frank Miller's general oeuvre, well, I can see like Todd being like, it was cool when he did that. I would argue that stuff overstays its welcome in Frank's work, and even just seeing it a couple times here, I know that they eventually kind of go away, but
it's an interesting gimmick for the first couple of times, and it almost adds a strange third perspective on the issue, because we know what Spawn knows because we're in his head with the captions. We know what Spawn doesn't know because we get to see things like these talking heads, but we also get to see what people think about what Spawn lost. We get to see people commenting on it directly in his world. So pretty much everybody but Spawn, including us, knows all these details. And that's kind of an interesting Greek chorus kind of thing. Some of that, I think, is motivated primarily by Todd McFarlane going, I got to get these details to the reader in one page.
It just feels like he doesn't really balance, like, I need to move plot forward with I need characters to do things. And it almost feels partly because of the splash pages. I get that huge 2-page splash is really, really, really cool. But
that could have been another page of story, another way of checking in on those, instead of going to the world famous assassin round the clock
Um,
funeral coverage.
yeah, and so Spawn's sort of sad about his wife still. He needs to get the costume off. We finally see that his face is like burned beyond, or burned or rotting or whatever.
Yeah, he's
And
zombified in a way.
yeah, his green eyes. He cries a little bit, so we know he's got feelings. He's hold. At one point, he's the panel with the trash can.
Where he's just holding the lid open.
Is it a really small trash can?
Maybe. The thing is, maybe it's one of those. I mean, it looks full size. The thing is about the hands is that Todd loves drawing these hands. This page is very hand focused, and the action follows his hands primarily with the gloves. You can tell that he just loves these as a symbol of the way Spawn is connecting the story to his body. And you also see him do a lot of that kind of hand language throughout the rest of the art, where like there'll be a page in the next issue, I think, where Violator is like draping a hand across his own horn in a weird way. And so we end this issue on, somewhere in time, a single shot of the Malebolgia laughing and saying, basically taunting Al Simmons that his problems have just begun.
To touch on the hands thing real quick, I am gonna say, and I don't think this was always the case, but I think Todd's not good at drawing hands.
I want to say that he's mid, and the thing is, I'll give him credit for focusing on it as a focal point, because that is a difficult thing to do, especially in comics, because hands are notoriously hard to draw.
Yeah.
We also see an incredibly strange little flat foot for Spawn floating over his face there on the one page. That's like basically three panels. And so I think in some ways it's him tackling the problem head on, but also I think it's very artistic and almost, there's some very Alphonse Mucha-like posing in his hands. The way the fingers overlap and intertwine. I think he just is having fun drawing these hands. And I say that as someone who has had fun just sitting and drawing hands like this. I think he's having fun using that as an expression of like Spawn's twisted body. At the same time, it's incredibly inconsistent, and it does look like half of them were drawn like while he was on the train on the way home.
As we get into issue 2, though, I think the first issue ends with next up the Violator as the sort of
the teaser, yeah,
which does make it seem like that's the Violator.
Yes, and you wonder, well, I'm sure that was the Malebolgia to begin with, but you wonder if that was an intentional tease, making people think they're going to see the Violator and that's him, because he does wind up looking somewhat like that.
I think it has to be. I think it's really clever, actually, because first page splash, we get a fat little clown.
The Violator.
Says, I am the Violator.
And half of the page is taken up by this beautiful Tom Orkowski like Kirby Crackle lettering that says, I'm the Violator. But the funny thing about it is, this is just looks like Danny DeVito as fucking the Joker. And he's doing shtick to an alley cat. But it's like he's doing it's like he's doing the aristocrats to an aristocat. And he's basically just saying, like, I'm going to tell him if he begs me really nice, I'm going to amputate his freaking legs. But if he puts up a fight, I'm going to rip his freaking guts out and make a milkshake out of his freaking heart. And just, like, doing shtick at this cat. And the thing is, much like Spawn winds up doing what he does in his first appearance in this issue, in the issue 1, through most of his time in Spawn Chapter 1 Questions. This is what Violator does through most of it. He stands there looking like a little weird version of the Joker to Spawn's twisted goth version, even more goth version of Batman, and saying, like, I could rip his freaking lungs out, I could kick his freaking nuts to his skull bones.
Here's the thing, and Violator says it, when you're striking fear into the hearts of others, a little bravado goes a long way. Besides, it seems to work in comics.
That's true.
So we get a little, like, fun meta, like Todd
Deadpool before Deadpool.
Deadpool at the same time as Deadpool?
Well, before Meta Deadpool. Don't
True.
let Rob Liefeld hear us say anything like that.
But you're right. I mean, you actually get a lot of characterization of Violator just from his weird rant about wanting to be gross and how he's going to kill Spawn.
Spends a lot of time talking about how he wants to, like, all the ways he wants to basically violate Spawn. And then we
Right.
cut to Spawn, and Spawn is doing what Spawn does, literally posing on a church roof, going, "My
My
wife."
wife. He was, Spawn, the original Borat, in a way.
My wife. There we go. Obligatory. The one and only that will ever happen as we move through wife guy Spawn territory.
It is definitely a bit of a, like, Stan Lee kind of any comic can be somebody's first, because we do get just kind of 2 pages where we get a recap of, like, the first issue. And so if you didn't read issue 1, if you missed it for some reason, you are caught up in about 2 pages. He doesn't really do anything except hug this cross at the top of this church.
And I think in some ways that also serves a bit of that function that you were mentioning before of that's 2 pages that Todd McFarlane knew how to write. And something that we should now bring up because we're getting into the second issue is that Spawn #1 was widely criticized for being written like shit. And that's only true if you're comparing it to other comics. If you're comparing it to itself, it's fun and it's fine. But when you start thinking about how it compares to the very literary adult comics of the day that had really ushered in the new collector era, like Watchmen, like Dark Knight Returns, Alan Moore and Frank Miller, who will both go on to work on Spawn in short order as a response to this specifically. Spawn's really written like a Stan Lee comic, where Todd drew something and then he goes, what can he be saying? I gotta have words on every panel. And just kind of writing something. And it's there's more craft to it than that. I'm not gonna say that he just threw any crap on the page. But it is not a writer-forward comic. And that will be something that will become a huge hallmark of Todd McFarlane's creative career. At one point at Comic-Con, in response to criticism of the early issues of Spawn, he debated Peter David on stage at Comic-Con about whether a writer or artist was more important to comics. The debate was considered closed because George Perez drew a response that basically took the side of Peter David that writers are essential, and just R.I.P. George Perez, another fallen king. We miss him dearly.
So I'm actually reading the print copies of the first few issues, first printings, so worth dozens of dollars,
sevens of dollars.
The first issue of Spawn, ironically, has a pinup of Spawn from George Perez.
Yeah, and so, like, George Perez was also, I think, one of Todd McFarlane's artistic inspirations.
Yeah, totally.
And you can see that in his design work, his very flamboyant design work, and his very intricate layouts and the attention to line work first and foremost.
The thing that Todd maintains, though, from that discussion with Peter David is, I could sell a comic drawn by Michelangelo but written by my dog. But I couldn't sell a comic written by Shakespeare, drawn by my mom.
Yeah, which is a very Todd McFarlane saying.
That is 85% a direct quote, and I get it, because I think, especially the first time I read Spawn, and I reviewed a bunch of the first 50 issues or so on Twitter. Is like, I read the first issue and I was like, I kind of put myself in the mindset of like, what if it was 1992 and I'm reading this? It's pretty cool. Like, it's not propulsive, but it doesn't fail at being a comic that at least makes you want to read the next issue.
It's very easy to read, especially when you're, as we are able to now, 30-something years on, able to binge read it and read it back to back. It does move at a pace that is easy to follow, and some of that is because a lot of the dialogue doesn't have to sink in. A lot of the captions don't have to sink in. And the art, they're there to justify the art. And, in a way, Todd McFarlane does have a point, because comics are a visual medium. A comic without an artist is just a prose. It's prose.
Just a book, and nobody can read those anymore.
No, why would you want to? There's so much pivoting to video to do.
Yeah.
So you understand some of that, and I kind of agree that there is a simplicity that comes to that is very like elementally comics focused.
Yeah. And I think as this issue kind of moves forward, that becomes more and more clear. We spent an issue kind of like introducing Spawn in issue 1. After Spawn reminds us what happened in issue 1, which, I think also too at a time when the internet is not really, you can't go easily find out what happened in the first issue if you weren't able to read it, right? It's not as easy. Yeah, there's merit to taking that Stan Lee approach of like, hey, let me recap for you real quick. But we go to the Dawn Core building, and we see like a business guy, and we get a lot of Tom Warzakowski,
Very cool, like sound effects and like
yeah. And then we get a clawed hand ripping through a door, ripping this
tearing out a
guy's
guy's heart.
Yeah, and then we get we get a look at a demon, but he doesn't look like the one we saw before, and he's like stroking his own horn,
leaning on his arm. Like I said, very tactilely in touch with himself in a strange way with that horn that comes up over his back. And so the page preceding this one is one of my favorites in this issue because even though some of the storytelling is a little bit tight, you get exactly what's happening at every part of it. Even when the Violator here, who this is the Violator in his demonic form, when he just pulls out like a big, basically looks like a balloon with a bunch of noodles coming out of it that's meant to be his heart. You know it's the heart. There's a thing in comics where if it looks right, it's right, and this looks like a guy getting his heart ripped out by a demon through a door. There's some very close shots of their eyes. It's not a splash page, and I think that partially because Todd wanted to do a splash page next to do what he did for Spawn and just show you Violator there basically as a pinup, so you get the idea of who this is. It maintains that almost horror movie kind of feeling in a really cool way through the storytelling.
Well, and it is fun to have a quick page like that because we're going to get right back to the talking heads.
We got some nice Savage Dragon references in here, basically just saying like this is in the Image world.
This is also where we get the Ninja Turtles reference, where the entertainment reporter says, and we get a Youngblood reference, right? Yeah, the Youngbloods changing their costumes. That's what our gay entertainment reporter is talking about now.
Oh, and then Youngblood basically becomes a synonym for superhero throughout this.
Right.
Like, Spawn wonders if he's a Youngblood and all this stuff.
Then he just starts trying to look for his wife, and we get I would say the first, like, pretty funny bit of the first arc is that when Spawn decides he's going to try to use his powers, it's still not clear what the timer does, because there's always an hourglass there, and we do find out later that it is measuring his power, but it's not clear that it's not measuring time, like time of powers.
It's a strange hourglass mechanic, and you get the message that it shows up every time he uses his abilities.
Right.
Spawn's powers are never really defined at any point. I think later there's more definition to them, but basically, I think even in Todd McFarlane's words, more or less, Spawn can do whatever he wants. He just has a finite amount of power, so the more spectacular the feat,
right,
the more power it expends, like your mana bar.
Right. So he needs to find Wanda, and he realizes that he looks like a corpse. He's got to change that. So he uses his power. However, I guess he thinks about it real hard, and he turns into a human being. But he's horrified to find that he's white. And
seems like, go ahead.
I mean, I guess technically we don't know that Al is black from the first issue.
Right, we don't know that going in. And this seems like the opposite side to being like, they met at the Republican National Convention, but as it turns out, he's a black man.
And they're black Republicans.
No, absolutely. I'm not trying to generalize anything. I'm just saying in Todd McFarlane's mind of his generalities, this to me seems to be him basically being like, here's the O. Henry twist. He can only turn himself white, but he was black. And of course, that makes Spawn one of the more prominent black heroes in comics ever. And in the 90s, even though he is not necessarily visibly black until we start getting flashbacks much later, or not even much later, but down the road, the punishment, the idea of a punishment for a black man only being able to use his infinite magic power to portray himself as a white man is so impossible to unpack without going deeper and deeper into the psyche of Todd McFarlane. But I think it does say something about the psyche of Todd McFarlane, because in his mind, this is very impactful, I think. When you look at this page of him realizing he's white, it's the parallel to that page when he took off his glove before, and he's relating to his body tactilely again and realizing, yet again, this is not my body. This is not the body I expect to be in. And I think that is the horror of the moment, is that body horror feeling of this is not my body, and no matter what I do, I can't make it my body. Which, weirdly relatable. I don't know how. But
it's also the opposite of Trading Places, right? In Trading Places, the horror is Dan Aykroyd being black.
And especially him in blackface.
Well, yeah.
But the horror is him having to be treated like his perspective is on how black people are treated by people in his social strata.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, and also we would get, we get a lot of instances, I think not a lot, but we get a number of instances in popular culture where black characters becoming white is like seen as such an upgrade. In a weird way,
it is kind of somewhat of a rejection of that trope. It's
like weirdly subversive. I don't think it means to be. I would love for Todd to talk about it more. I don't know that he meant to do it, but it's a weird thing that ages actually pretty well and brings a little bit of depth to the story in a way that is, I don't think all the pieces necessarily mean to be that way. But
I don't think it's like woke Todd McFarlane or something like that on any level. But I think it's Todd McFarlane, again, swinging with a very wide arc and aiming for archetypes and stereotypes on some level. But I think it does hold up a little bit. And again, I don't exactly know how to comment on whether it's good or bad or what. But I think one thing that it doesn't do is immediately have him go, oh, well, I'm white. Well, now I'll go down to the bank or something fucking totally racist like that. Like, he does use the fact that he doesn't look like his old self to his advantage somewhat, but it's not presented as, it's presented as a curse because it's not who he is.
Right.
And like, again, black identity, I don't think is necessarily something that's forefront on Todd McFarlane's mind.
Yeah.
He's not but I don't think he's trying to make that kind of a political statement. But I think that it winds up making a kind of strangely, especially for the time, a very strange and very impactful moment. It does wind up having a lot of impact because you can really feel the character's horror. And I guess there is something very transgressive about someone in the 90s being horrified to be white.
Yeah, absolutely. We do move forward into another Sam and Twitch page, which I get such a kick out of them. We didn't really talk too much about their character design, except for the fact that when you said Penn and Teller, it finally clicked for me. They are definitely like noir detective Penn and Teller.
Or like there's a Stadler and Waldorf quality in a way, but Penn and Teller, because Twitch is kind of very straightforward and matter of fact, and of course he speaks.
Right.
But
the two of them I just think are great.
It says Los Angeles Times, heart attacks.
For everybody.
So this also establishes that we're in Los Angeles firmly, by the way, because this is the LA Times speaking about the murders of the people who are having their hearts ripped out, which Sam and Twitch are investigating.
Are they? No, that's impossible. They can't be in LA. And we're going to find that out in a few pages.
Well, I think we've uncovered one of our first continuity errors, but maybe that doesn't matter. It's possible that the news is reaching as far as Los Angeles.
And also maybe Sam just reads all the newspapers.
That's fair. Maybe he seems like a big wonk. You know what I mean? Like a newspaper guy, like a real tactile information guy. Speaking of which, we go right back to the Violator on the next page, who's back to his heart ripping. This is a fun another horror scene where this mob guy is just begging for Jesus over and over. and Violator is again just doing shtick at him, which seems to be the worst torture of the Violator. Is that before he rips your heart out, he's gonna be like, "Hey, did I ever tell you about the time my frickin' spawn?" And he's gonna get real in depth about how he's gonna hurt you.
Better looking heart this time too. Looks more like a heart. Great job, Todd.
A little bit. It is kind of just kidney shaped with little noodles hanging off of it, but it's also meant to be bouncing and in motion. You can tell Todd McFarlane was not looking at Grey's Anatomy or something like that.
There's no need. It's what you said before, right? You don't need to know what it is if you can tell what it is.
Right.
We're gonna move forward into more of Al is still on top of the church, but he doesn't want to stay in this form that he's in now. So he changes back, but he gets a new flash of his identity. And we meet Jason Wynn for the first time, who was his boss and his mentor. He's the CIA director. And we also see Al's original form for the first time, which is cool. But, we are led to understand a little bit here that Jason has lost his way. There's something very altruistic and good about
world famous
Al.
government assassin Al Simmons.
Yeah, even though he kills people for a living and everybody knows about it. And this, just like the last issue, he has this realization. He uses powers, so he passes out.
And we get another glimpse at the time or the power bar.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. In these early issues, that power bar just flies down. It's just going down. And so there's no real rhyme nor reason to how much power is being used, how that works. I do tend to like things with rules. This has the appearance of rules, but then it's almost like the art, where the art's I know you've read a comic book before, but not this one. And so
it's easy to paint yourself into a corner when you want the bar to go down, and then the bar has to go down every single time he uses his powers, and he uses his powers a lot because that's what the comic is. One thing that I think is interesting about this page, and kind of about Spawn as world-famous government assassin Al Simmons, is that, again, there's a sort of divide for Todd McFarlane, at least in his philosophy for this character and the way he's thinking about these characters and their effects in the world around them. There is a divide between action and morality. And it doesn't matter what Spawn does. It doesn't matter who he kills or why. Because one, he's doing it for a supposedly altruistic reason unto himself. And two, because everything he does is in pursuit of his love of Wanda and his family and his willingness to harm those who harm him. And that seems to be the elemental morality that goes into this. And that's why when we have things like Spawn's secret identity is Al Simmons, black man, but he is transformed into anonymous white man when he uses his power to try and reclaim his identity, that has to be viewed through the same lens as that brute force morality of that it's not even a black and white sort of heroes are heroes and villains are villains, Steve Ditko kind of objectivist thing. It's almost a purely subjective morality, where as long as he holds true to what is subjectively important to him, then he is objectively correct in his morality as a hero. And that's presented to us over and over again with the altruism of his actions compared to Jason Wynn.
I think it is, again, Al says this so much throughout it. He's being toyed with, he's being played with, he's being, somebody's playing a trick on him. And when we kind of know that from the sort of deal that he's made with Malebolgia, that things are not as they seem. And it's almost that it's not that his powers are necessarily can be used for right or wrong. It's that they can't be used in pursuit of the thing that he wants.
Right,
well,
exactly. And that's why, again, that goes back to that same morality of his subjective desire and his subjective belief in what's right and what's good becomes the objective goal for Spawn.
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting. This is again where when I think when we try to parse anything about what Todd's sort of outlook is, we don't get to find it, because unlike similar stories, revenge is not the top priority.
No.
Love is really the top priority, and I think that is it's an interesting take. We don't really see a lot of stories that are love motivated first. And if we do, it's because of revenge. It's like, my wife was killed, I will kill who killed her.
Like The Punisher or something like that, or revenge fantasy. And so again, though, it's not even like, and that's exactly the thing about why trying to decipher Todd McFarlane's politics from Spawn is almost a fool's errand, because he kind of purposely flattens them out into that lowest common denominator. Like, this is a superhero comic, not a treatise. I think, though, that you get a better window into his psyche than his politics in a way, because again, we know for a fact that Todd McFarlane's number one priority is his wife Wanda, literally. And so just like with Spawn, he transplants that one subjective element of morality and guiding light onto Spawn, and then from there he says, also Spawn's a good guy, so anytime he has an opportunity to instinctively do something good, like when he saved that woman from being assaulted, he will do that because he's instinctively a good guy. He's also instinctively a good guy who, for his job, is a world famous government assassin.
So I mean, and the thing is, like, Malebolgia kind of recruits him to be the same thing, right? He is a good guy who must do bad things, but it's okay because he's a good guy. So the bad things he's doing must be kind of good.
And Todd McFarlane takes that. We're going to get, that's something that comes up a little bit later in this arc, but we might as well just start jumping through this, because honestly, a lot of what's happening in issue 2 and 3, issue 2 ends with the first conversation between Violator, the clown version of Violator, and Clown basically promising, again, pain. Oh, the very funny thing about that is, though, before they meet, Spawn is just like lurking over the city, and he looks down and he goes, "Who's that funny little fucking guy?" And it's just Clown like running away into the shadows on a rooftop. Then later he sees him again, and that's why they interact. And Spawn goes, "Oh, it's that little funny guy." And the Clown goes, yeah, some little fucking funny guy. And the arc kind of, it's a little stagnated in the sense that we know that Violator is taking the hearts of these mobsters. Sam and Twitch are investigating this, and there is
nobody's really getting anywhere.
Nobody's getting anywhere. And so then it kind of stalls out a little bit. But so what comes to pass towards the end is this idea that Spawn has been sent back to Earth as a Spawn, like hellspawn, was where the name comes from. Everybody is quick to point that out.
Not like Salmon.
In order to kill as many evildoers as possible and to prevent them from doing evil, because then they will go to hell, where their souls will strengthen the army of Malebolgia in his eventual war on God. So Spawn is caught in this, honestly, kind of interesting fundamental morality trap of, okay, it's my instinct and my power to go and do good, but by doing that, I know I am ultimately helping someone do evil. And it's this kind of vague trolley problem thing that is a little bigger than I think Todd McFarlane can handle necessarily on his own. And that,
I think that what you said earlier about him sort of flattening everything, like he's like, Spawn's not really thinking about it that much. You shouldn't think about it that much. And the third issue starts with exactly what Spawn is thinking about. The first word on the page is him yelling Wanda at nobody in particular. Theoretically, he just has his back to Violator for all we know, because it's just a close up of his face.
And the last issue ended on them basically just looking at each other.
He's like walking away from Violator.
Yeah.
And in this issue, he's just still walking. He just walks for 3 pages and he talks to himself. He's got some questions. Actually, does he really? Yeah, he's got some questions. Oh, yeah, because he's like, what was that weird little guy about? There's a thing about the way that Todd sets all this up.
Is this Spawn being revealed as neurodivergent? Because it's extremely relatable to me to be walking away from a confrontation and for 3 pages of time talking to myself going, what was that guy about? What was that interaction? What were we actually talking about?
This is where he sort of is like, this is where like Todd gives him something to do, where he's just like, I need to go get the file on Wanda because, like, obviously somebody's got a file on her, and I'll get the file and I'll figure out what's going on because I used to be in the military. The military's got files. And so you're like, yeah, all right. And then he kind of like talks about the larger deal, but he's sort of like, it's just like, well, whatever, I got to deal with this now. We get more Malebolgia, which is great. I think Malebolgia's fun. I think it's funny that the character design for Malebolgia and the character design for Roger from American Dad are basically the same. I'm not wrong, right?
No, you're not. Very much like eggplant with arms and legs kind of thing. And like, yeah, no, I mean, Todd McFarlane has a certain look that he thinks demons are like, and that he thinks is gross for demons to be like.
Which is
and it's
cool.
Kind of cool.
I'm into it. I do like also that somewhere in time always seems to be the moon.
Yeah, you can never exactly tell where it is. But there's some interesting panel layout stuff here where, like, on this last page of Malebolgia monologuing about, like, our army must grow and you've been selected to speed up that growth, where that's all revealed. It's like a shot of his face in the upper right corner.
Oh,
and
I
his
love the
body
hair,
is
yeah.
coming down, like his hair is coming down into the panel gutters.
Yeah,
and it's
cool.
very interesting.
See, but this is where I think the webbing earlier like does not work. And when he gets into stuff that feels specific to the characters in Spawn, I'm like all about it.
Yes, it is a much more successful version of that. And so then we get some more Sam and Twitch ruminating over who's killing these guys. More of the Violator just going, I'm the Violator. He does
in case
this.
You forgot.
He sings this de-loop-de-loo. De-loop-de-lie. I know a hero who's gonna die. I'm a poet and I don't even know it. Not that good a rhyme, but you kind of had to make up some scatting crap to go with it. But the funny thing is, almost every time we see Sam and Twitch sitting together going, who is killing these guys? The next thing you see is the Violator going, it's me, I'm the Violator.
Here's one thing I like, and I do think that this is on purpose. As it gets, so earlier they were just on two separate pages that weren't next to each other, right? Like Violator wasn't even in the first issue, but we got Sam and Twitch. Next time that Sam and Twitch are talking, the next page is the Violator killing somebody. Now, Sam and Twitch are the top half, Violator is the second half of the page. Like, to me, I was like, oh, they're getting closer. Like,
yes.
we are getting closer to like figuring this out, sort of.
That's the kind
that
of
is so cool.
It is, and it's the kind of thing where you know, like, okay, that is Todd McFarlane doing intentional storytelling.
Yeah.
I don't think that happened by accident. I want to give Todd McFarlane the credit that he thought about that specifically over these issues, because it is such a nice bit of, again, very cinematic storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the thing about Spawn, is it's very, I kind of think it's a cliche to use that word for comics now, especially when comic movies are so prevalent. But this is in a time before that where that cinematic feeling is something that Todd McFarlane is capturing in a way that few other artists in comics are doing. The quick cuts on the eyes back and forth when it's the Violator ripping out the guy's heart. The way Sam and Twitch and Violator get closer together. It is very, very competent sequential storytelling and very interesting sequential storytelling. And in a way, It is very filmic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why I think some of the splashes are so disappointing. Because even though the art is well rendered, they turn into just images with text and not anything else. They're just pinups with text. And when that's a big moment that's really effective, I don't really think that like some of the moments hit as well when it's like a bust of Spawn.
Right.
I've seen his face 1,000 times at this point. You know, I think
there's
I'm
some good examples of that coming up. But before we get to that, there's this little 2-page sequence at the CIA New York headquarters where he goes to get the files. Because, you know, the CIA has the files. Where he goes in and he interrupts this very stereotypical, like, shitty boss. He almost looks like Dabney Coleman from 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Hitting on his secretary in the CIA headquarters at midnight. And Spawn goes, don't fuck with her no more. I'm getting the files. Again, I reiterate, don't fuck with her. I'm taking the files. And so he does. And that's where we get back into a little bit of this kind of okay. There's a little more. There's another sequence of him reading the files,
But
and
but also too, right before he starts reading the files, Malebolgia shows up now on a page with Spawn. Same
yes,
kind of thing where Malebolgia is now getting closer to Spawn, the same way Sam and Twitch are getting closer to the Violator. So these story elements are like slowly, like glacial pace, sort of.
coming together in an arc.
Like the
yes.
fact that it takes 3 issues for this is like it's glacially paced, but the fact that it starts to happen is really great.
The next thing that happens is Spawn turns back into, in his words, some kind of California beach bum. just literally just the most generic ass white guy.
Is it not Rob Liefeld in that panel?
I mean, look at the feet and you tell me. You know that Rob.
I was thinking more the face shape, but
that's true. But I'm just saying, you know, his feet look like that in real life. And we should not be making fun of how he renders them as a result. This is an example of what's the point of this fucking splash page, where this is where we first get Spawn, Al Simmons in his white guy mode, visiting Wanda and seeing her for the first time in 5 years since his death. He has to go see her, and she opens the door, and what we get is this weird little dog, which looks demented.
The dog looks like it could become like Spawn dog.
It looks like Todd McFarlane was like, I think I know what a dog looks like. And she's wearing a wedding dress, just for whatever reason. They don't really explain why. Maybe they're going out or something.
No, they explain why. She's dressed like that because
you're right. She was just trying it on to see if it fits for her business party. The real answer is Todd McFarlane wanted Spawn to see his wife in a wedding dress as a shock to him. And my favorite part of this is, okay, it's just a splash page of Wanda standing in front of these kind of generic color bars. We get the idea that this is Spawn's head spinning. My favorite thing is she goes, "Good day, may I help you?" Like a fucking Baldur's Gate NPC. Like she's about to try and sell him bricks or something.
The thing is, the other thing is that like across these 2 pages, I really like some of the expression work, and then I really hate some of the expression work. I think mostly the baby ruins it. We'll find across this book that no matter who's drawing it, children are a nightmare, and that's a problem for a lot of artists. But I kind of like, I don't know, I like the way that Todd overall like draws people. Wanda looks great.
Yeah, and I mean there's an intention to it where you know he's drawing someone, much like his friend Terry. Is that Terry Fitzgerald?
Yeah.
AKA the editor of the book. As we mentioned, Todd McFarlane loves to name characters after people he knows or admires, and that will become a huge part of his life down the road.
Who does he hate named Billy? Because the guy menacing his secretary was named Billy, and we're gonna meet Billy Kincaid in a few issues.
Bet that so I've got this Spawn companion that was published by Wizard Magazine in 1996, and one of the features in it is a spread where they go through and say who all the characters are named after in Todd McFarlane's life, and some of them are vicious. Like there's white supremacists named after John Byrne and Peter David, which is just a whole thing. But I think he was kind enough not to force Billy Kincaid on anyone.
Oh, that's good. That's something.
So Spawn says he's with the SPCA and he's checking dog licenses.
Sure.
And then he goes in and he passes out again, and he wakes up to see that Wanda has married his best friend Terry Fitzgerald. She says that after her husband died, they just connected, and it took a few years, but they found each other, and they have a daughter named Cyan. Now,
which is his real life daughter's name.
Yes, his real life daughter's name is Cyan. And again, we're just really at the first window into the parallels of Todd McFarlane wife guy, Todd McFarlane family man, and Al Simmons wife guy family man. And you see that the worst horror that he can think of to inflict on this man, what he believes hell is that his family existence going on without him. And he's thinking in archetypes: wife, husband, best friend.
Right.
And then the next page, after he leaves, they watch him go, and they're like, "Well, see you later." And he says, "You're beautiful and happy," and she says, "That's very sweet," and he leaves. And the next page starts with another classic Orzechowski, or I guess that's actually a McFarlane moment, if I had to guess, but possibly an Orzechowski. A huge no ringing out over the city.
Oh, I love it. I think it's so good. But I
And then we
think
get
it's
this.
got to be Todd because it's so incorporated in the art. I'm not really
Yeah,
sure
I
how
think
it would
so.
exist.
But that speaks to the visual language that Tom Orzechowski created heretofore, because it looks like Todd doing his best version of fitting in with that. And then you get like this actually kind of cool. I remember this panel coming up a lot in like Spawn advertisements and stuff. This kind of cool, very monstrous, like totally engulfed in green flame version of Spawn, where he's ranting about how this is only a true sadist could put him through this and come get his soul.
Yeah, it rules. Honestly. And also it makes it so I think that this is the first time that green really, aside from the covers, we haven't really talked about the covers.
I mean, it's
and I
been
guess
through, but this is like one of the first times where you see Spawn just like exuding like tons
Power.
of green energy in this way.
Yeah.
And that becomes his hallmark, which you'd think would come off as Christmassy because he's got that big red cape. But instead, because that's such an underused color combination in comics because of the Christmas connection, it comes off as kind of eerie and very iconic, this red, green, white, black palette that really informs the rest of the book, both in terms of when that palette is being used and when, like we observed in those early Sam and Twitch pages, when it's totally absent in favor of more grounded earth tones and browns.
You know, until you said the Christmas thing, it never occurred to me.
Well,
Like,
why
truly
would
never.
it? Because
Yeah,
it doesn't look like that. It has.
It doesn't play that way because it's this like unearthly green, and I
Well,
think
and
that really works.
And I think also inverting that expectation that these are Christmas colors, it doesn't occur to you, but the connection between the colors is still there, and it still looks like a unified palette, but in a way it's an inversion of something, Santa, Satan.
Yeah.
There it is. Todd
And then, of
McFarlane's
course,
whole gimmick.
just as you're maybe making that connection, clown version of Violator returns. And
Yes.
he's wondering why they didn't get a chance to share their common interests, like killing and maiming and slaughtering and destroying.
And it's obviously on cue because Spawn is saying, "You want my soul? Come get it. Let's see who's got the power." Then you get this like 8821 counter, which like we're already like fucking like 20% down on his power level in issue
Right.
3. And Todd, math, think it through.
But also,
I'm not good at it either, but
it has not been explained to us yet that that's his power meter.
no.
We don't
But
know that, and neither does Al.
Next when he says, "Let's see who's got the power," and then it shows his power meter, and then we have this very abstract image of funny enough, of Clown in an Image T-shirt, which he's been wearing this whole time, going, Mr. Spawn dude," which like very, very hello fellow kids of Todd McFarlane,
Yeah. Well, I guess he's what, like 31 at this point?
56, 72, 103. Todd McFarlane was born 41 years old, and he will die 41 years old. But we see finally the Clown turning into the Violator, and this is the first time in the comic those two characters have been, I think, fully connected in that way.
Yeah, we haven't seen them on panel together. Oh, no, well, they at the end of issue 2, we do understand that the Clown is Violator, but Al does not know that.
But this is where we get the transformation.
Yeah, and
we
this
see
is
that transformation.
And this is the first time Al becomes aware kind of the Violator in general.
Honestly, kick-ass transformation sequence.
Yeah, really cool.
Another great page that's very like American Werewolf in London, kind of like his jaw distending and the flesh splitting around it. Kind of taking a heightened, an extremely heightened take on the Venom transformations.
Mm-hmm. Kind of also the kind of thing that I wish was like a Rob Bottin special effect in a movie.
Right.
Like The Thing, Or
very, very, or very in some ways Tom Savini with like that stretching jaw. But I love that on the next page he tells Spawn, "They said you had a lot of spunk. Let's see how much heart you have." And again, not written in 2020. They weren't doing phrasing. But it's a cool page because Violator instantly says, They said you were super powerful. Let's see what you got, and just tears Spawn's heart right out again, and dangles it in front of his face like a little ornament.
Now, I do think though. So I mean, the Spawn's going to be fine. Obviously, like he gets up a page later, and we get a really cool double page splash.
One of the best ones, I think, in these first 4 issues, because
so cool.
it's really worthy of it because it's such a big moment of supposedly the 2 arch enemies coming together.
It is also the best line to finish an issue, and the best line that's been in a splash so far in the series, where
Violator has his back turned and he's walking away from Spawn, who's face down.
And he says like, oh, and Violator kind of says like, oh, you're just like a human. And then we get this huge double page splash of Violator turning back around to Spawn, and Spawn with a hole in his chest with green energy in it saying, who said anything about being human?
And you get a really sick, like the hand with his engulfed in flame is really good, especially with right below it, Violator's hand holding the heart. Again, hands is something that is this connection, this tactile connection between these characters.
Yeah, and it rules.
Yeah.
I would say that like Spawn obviously is one of the coolest designs of any character, and it is so over the top, and that's kind of why it's so wonderful.
You get the like weird crotch thong thing that his costume did at one point,
which is the trial of Magneto M on his chest, right? Like, why does he have an M on his chest?
Predates that, I think, because when you see the original, very early Spawn designs, it's exactly what he had.
True.
Was that wraparound, but it was more of a corset.
Yeah.
That was like kind of like coming up under his bust. Todd McFarlane tends to play fast and loose with how those shapes, that triangle stretches into his torso and around his form, and you can see even in this it's not super consistent. But this page fucking rules, and it was kind of one of those like pages that was again used in a lot of Spawn advertisements, and you would see this and you would see Spawn with his heart ripped out and Violator standing there with it and Spawn just standing against him. And it's such a cool page. And also the thing that that is established here is that Violator is there on Earth for the same reason as Spawn.
Right.
And the reason is to kill people to send them back to Malebolgia. But he's jealous of Spawn because Spawn has cooler powers and a nice costume and seems to be favored by the Malebolgia.
Yeah, there's this idea that being a demon is lesser than being a hellspawn.
He's so alien, and his form is so twisted from a human form. Like his hands are all spindly and weird, and his jaw is all distended. He's got horns all over his body. It's just a very interesting and compelling comparison to Spawn, who, despite being engulfed in hell, remains very human-like, especially when his costume is on. So issue 4 opens with just a close-up on that hand of Spawn. I almost said Todd's heart. Isn't that funny? So this close-up on Violator holding Spawn, still beating heart, and another great piece of lettering from Tom Orzechowski, where down the back of the page, behind the whole thing, it goes thump thump, thump thump, thump thump, thump thump. So you know that the heart is still just beating in Violator's hand. And around that is a whole bunch of fucking words that basically sets up how sad Spawn is and how his whole return was based on finding his wife.
I will say that it's the most Claremontian that the narration gets. Yes. Because it's a little mean.
And it gets down to that metaphor at the end. It all builds to that metaphor of his heart has been torn out physically and emotionally.
Yeah. But like when he says, while seeing his wife, he also learned that she was happily remarried. Worse than that, the one thing she'd always wanted, the one thing Al could never give her, had been delivered.
Oh, that's the other thing about him seeing Wanda with the kid that I forgot about. Forgot to mention is that it establishes that Al
his
and
boys
Wanda
don't swim.
Wanted to have a baby, but he's got a narrow urethra or something like Hank Hill. And so he turns out that definitively, at least in terms of the universe of Todd McFarlane, definitively Al Simmons couldn't provide his wife with a child, while Terry Fitzgerald could, as some biological fact of life. And for this moment, that shows another one of Todd McFarlane's worst fears, that he couldn't have a family. Because again, every time he says, these are things that are my worst fear, it relates to his wife, his family, the way his ability to interact and be with them. and the distance between them is hell for Al Simmons. So we get this big, and then we get when you turn the page, you get the follow-up splash page.
The second best splash page in the whole thing,
and it
also
works because it's like a panel transition.
Yeah, he's like, oh, it's issue 3.5. Like, it's not even issue 4. We're just still in the same scene even. And this is where I think that actually a little bit better pacing in the first few issues. This should still be issue 3.
Right.
We learned so much over and over and over again. We also learned on the first page of this that it's only been a week or so
since Spawn woke up 5 years into the future after his murder. And so it's very cool. It's a close-up shot of that heart again, which just looks like a lump of flesh at this point, and Violator squeezing it, covered in blood. Spawn healing his wounds with the bones coming up over the energy and stuff. And the next page is Violator just ranting. He doesn't need a heart. He doesn't need his heart. So this is where you get into the first big knockdown, drag-out, multi-page fight of Spawn. And honestly, it kicks ass. Like, maybe not always the cleanest storytelling. Again, Todd McFarlane, lots of hand close-ups. I would say almost more than anything else, he relies on that as storytelling because it's very tactile. You imagine what it would feel like to have a heart in your hand. You imagine what it would feel like to have energy coursing through your fingertips. And also it shows the tactile relationship that these characters have to their actions. And,
it's something that he mentioned in I was watching his episode of Comic Book Greats with Stan Lee, which if nobody's ever seen is a great weird little time capsule. But they're talking about drawing, and basically Stan's like, how do you draw all the stuff you draw? And he just goes, well, and he's like, and how can the kids these days learn to draw like you? And Todd says, he's like, if you can't draw something, draw it 1,000 times. And it almost feels like, and I was lamenting the hands in the first issue, but they've gotten so much better by issue 4.
They're still very expressive, but like there's more consistency into how their fingers are shaped, especially Spawn's weird spindly claw fingers. I remember when I was learning to draw as a young teen, one of the things that drew me to Spawn, we talked about this, was the art. And I would just sit and draw Todd McFarlane hands with those creepy pointy fingers because I thought that just looked so weird and interesting. And so we get some big, we're going to be Orzakowski stance on this whole podcast for hundreds of issues or whatever, but we get this big moment where it's a top and bottom split of 2 pages where you see the top where Spawn's shooting this huge energy blast and the bottom where it's blasting through Violator. And instead of cluttering up any of that with like captions, we get this
like scroll
page at the very end. It is isometrically lettered. So like the letters follow the shape of the scroll instead of like an old Stan Lee like store scroll where it would be a curved scroll and the letters just flat on it. The letters are curved with the scroll, which is just a nice, interesting touch that also adds to the motion of the energy beam going through Violator towards the end of the page. They are clashing. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of speed lines. Again, a lot of close-up on Violator's hands and Spawn's hands as they're interacting in this fight, because that's another fast way to show motion and movement and time passing between panels. Then you get the penultimate double-page spread of the fight, which is, again, Spawn blasting Violator and then Violator ripping Spawn's arm off. But instead of seeing Violator take Spawn's arm off, we get Tom Orzakowski guiding the action by making the shape of the panel, the letters, into the shape of the panel where it says Chomp, and you see the blood splatter across where it says Chomp. And then the next page is literally just Spawn's arm hanging there in the air while these huge sound effects basically make up the entire page. That was the day that Todd had to do business calls.
Okay,
but he still needed to get a page done. You know what I'm saying?
I'm glad we're on the same page here because I remember reading this for the first time and I was like, you just ran out of time on this one, didn't you? Because the rest of the fight is so rendered. Like, he's not overly hiding things in shadows. I think Violator must take a little while to draw, and he's got to draw them in like every goddamn panel.
It's also this very classic samurai movie kind of thing, where it's this moment that's too fast to see.
Yeah.
Violator takes off Spawn's arm, and you get this chomp with the blood splatter, and then you get tunch, this huge sound effect that says tunch with the green slime spray, and they're saying, you take this, and you take that, and you're just seeing these captions as their arms are flying back and forth across the panel,
Yeah,
across
it's
the
super
page.
Looney Tunes.
It is, and it's very like you get the impression that like limbs are just flying, almost like the Tasmanian Devil or something, and it's this super fast action. Really, it's a day that Todd McFarlane needed a break, and Tom Warzakowski really stepped up to the plate to make it look like part of a storytelling decision. Way better than like say the 9 pages of white panel in Alpha Flight. So it gives way to probably the most words yet. And there's a lot of pages that have words. It's Malebolgia saying, like it or not, I'm your daddy. And like a good parent, I can see I need to share some of my insight. Malebolgia just seems very like, even down to his name, seems very like mob boss demon to me. He says, destiny and damnation, you control neither. So even though you struggle to make sense of what's happening, it doesn't matter because I run both your lives. And that is Todd McFarlane's approach to comic books and writing and storytelling. It doesn't fucking matter if you're confused because I run your lives. I know what's going on.
I kind of wish that Malebolgia had the same hair as Todd McFarlane so we could just know that for certain. Because I will say the one thing about Malebolgia's design that is more bizarre than Malebolgia himself is whatever hair products he uses.
He has this Vince Neil wall of like
yes, that's
Aquanet
what it is.
hair. Which may be better than a Todd McFarlane, Jerry Seinfeld, like 90s Superman kind of look.
But imagine that.
The
would
funny
also
thing
be
is,
kind of cool.
It would. What's the deal with Al Simmons being Spawn? There's a lot of words here, and sometimes I hate that in comics, especially one as visually focused as Spawn. But there's also some of Todd McFarlane's most interesting and annoying writing. He loves doing these wordplay parallels with Malebolgia on this page where he says destiny and damnation, vigor and humor, all this stuff. And he says to Al Simmons, there is a God, and you don't have any control over what happens to him or to me or to anyone in this universe. So I'm going to give you a new arm just to prove to you that I can do whatever I want and to make sure nothing stands in the way of you fulfilling the mission I have given you.
Also, Malebolgia grows some horns between pages.
Yes, he does. He's almost shifting forms. That first shot of Malebolgia standing there all big with his weird tummy and his Ken doll crotch would look so much cooler if he did have those big ass horns that he has on the second page. But he's almost got that like Beavis and Butthead like underbite.
Yeah. But I actually kind of like that then later when he is like kneeling down at Violator and Spawn, his underbite is so pronounced because it didn't seem like that before. So, it's one thing that we're going to see throughout this book is like, for instance, and we'll get to it at a later episode, but the fact that the suit is alive was like not a thing until there needed to be a reason that he didn't draw Spawn consistently. And it was like, oh, I don't know, the fucking suit's alive. Don't worry about it.
That becomes interesting. And I loved that as a teenager too, because again, it's just him going back to his own Spider-Man career and being like,
I don't know, like Venom. Don't worry about it.
But the thing, again, not to harp on it too much, but I love this panel of Malebolgia kneeling. And I love that weird Grinchy face because it is just a huge, exaggerated manga-esque kind of grin where the expression becomes the art and he's laughing and mocking Al Simmons.
I was going to say that also Malebolgia. Todd's voice for Malebolgia, like his like speech pattern, it's the same as Todd's for the opening of the HBO Spawn show.
Yes, it's very exactly narratorly.
Yeah,
especially with those word plays like damnation, dignity, destiny and damnation is what he says. And then there's a second panel under that of like Spawn staring down his face, and it's that like big close up that like of like, when you see someone look out a window and Godzilla's eye is right there. It's very reminiscent of that, very horror movie kind of shot that shows that Malebolgia is all encompassing in Spawn's life. And so it ends with Malebolgia restoring Spawn's arm and Violator begging, hey, how about me? I've been killing all these guys. I want something for my effort. I'm a selfish demon. And Malebolgia says, you can have whatever I want because you failed miserably. You're a sad excuse for hell. You are being grounded. And he traps Violator in his clown form, which I just noticed, interestingly enough, has only 3 fingers on each hand, like a Simpsons character. And that's consistent in both of the. That's consistent. I just noticed it, but that makes him just that clue that he is something alien.
Yeah.
And this establishes that now Spawn is free of the Violator. He's still going to be an issue, a problem with some of these things, but he almost takes on the role of the Violator in the next issue. But before that, at the end of issue 4, the end of Spawn, questions. There is this interesting 2-page spread where he's in the city, he's walking around like Raphael or like Ben Grimm in the classic like brown trench coat and hat combo to disguise that he's, fucking Spawn. And these 2 kids are like, look, it's that new superhero. One of them says, hey, Rob, look, it's that new superhero. And they run over.
And
the
he's like,
next
oh,
page,
look at him, Eric, because it's clearly Rob Liefeld and Eric Larson.
And it cuts to the next page, and you see that they're talking about the Savage Dragon, who's all over TV, who lives in Chicago. And they say, I told you he was rad, which, like, that is a fun... I love that. I mean, honestly, like, that's a little silly, but that is a fun example of him being like, of course Rob and Eric will love the Savage Dragon and the Youngbloods. So,
by the way, is this argument between this Eric and Rob a real argument that was had? They're arguing about whether or not Savage Dragon could take on Bedrock from the Youngbloods. And I want to imagine that it was real.
My favorite part is that he says, give me a break. The Rock is a sissy. Different guy now.
The hierarchy of power is about to change in the Image Comics universe.
Wow, it sure is. So it's him saying, like, well, or it's him wandering off and the kid's saying, who wants to be normal anyway? And Wanda awakens from a dream on the final page of this arc. It's that quote, who wants to be normal anyway, carrying over into Wanda's normal life, which is awakened by, we don't see exactly what, but her literally breaking out of sleep with these kind of shattered glass images of her having a vision of Al and feeling like it was so real, like he was still with them. Kind of relating back to that moment from earlier when they came face to face, and he kind of took the high road and claimed to be a dog licensor instead of, spilling his guts and saying, like, I'm your dead husband and I'm now white.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great, and it ends the arc on a note of like, we're not finished here. Like, we've really only just started this journey, and even though we're still not really sure what the stakes are for anybody other than Al, now we get a little bit of like Wanda's interiority, which to this point women have had zero interiority throughout like 4 issues. They exist to be menaced, to be rescued. They are damsels, right?
Because there's nothing more elemental to Todd McFarlane than Al Simmons being like, well, I guess I'm a hero at heart because I go around saving women.
But also, too, I think that he expects to get to do the same thing with Wanda. And I would like to think that Todd McFarlane is a feminist. I'm saying that half jokingly because, as we've kind of established, like, you can't really read into any of this. I think some of it's just happenstance. However, I do think this is a good beat. This is saying, like, Wanda is an important character in this story. Wanda is a character. She is not just this object that Al lusts after. And actually, Terry gets a tiny bit of characterization as well, where he says, like, listen, you can, I understand that you're going to keep seeing this guy in your dreams. Like, I didn't say you didn't have to talk about it. Like, you can if you want. And like, it really grounds those characters in a way that Al does seem crazy. However, a very crazy thing happened to him. These 2 characters are real people who live in the real world and deal with real problems in a real way. And he doesn't diminish them or the things that have happened to them to this point. Which I think is like really deft bit of writing, I think, in something that is otherwise pretty uneven, otherwise kind of moving the chains to get to something that it never really quite knows what it's getting to. Like, you couldn't convince me that there's an outline for this arc.
No, I think there's probably an elevator pitch version, which is Spawn is adjusting to his powers while he's getting caught up in this murder mystery that's also involving, his new archenemy, this demon, and these cops that are going to become kind of foils to him.
Mm-hmm.
There's an obvious, very broad idea of what this is, but it doesn't really all come together. It doesn't really all line up. And some of that is, obviously Todd McFarlane kicking the can down the road because he knows he wants to write more later. But then there is this very nice bookend moment with Wanda and Terry where you get this reason totally not to hate Terry Fitzgerald at all. You get this reason why Wanda loves him, which is because he doesn't begrudge her love of Al Simmons, even as it exists in the context of their partnership and their love. And again, of course, Wanda is a character who has feelings and emotions because she is Wanda. And that is the guiding light of both Todd McFarlane and Al Simmons' life in a way that I think, we keep harping on that, and I keep making the Todd wife guy joke. But it's really not a joke. He is that prototypical wife guy where he just loves his wife, sees her as a partner, sees her as a human being, brings her into his world and his business in this way while she's, co-editing this comic. She was there when Spawn was created, they've been together since he was a teenager.
Her and Cyan appear in the Comic Book Greats episode.
Yeah.
And Stan talks to them for a little bit. And basically, Todd's like, I couldn't do it without her. Like, I wouldn't know. That's my first tip to anybody. Find somebody who's got your back all the time.
And that's so endemic to what you are seeing here is that Wanda still has that. Yeah. Wanda still has someone who has her back in that way, in the form of Terry, who would have also had Al's back. He is saying to her, I'm with you. I understand your grief, and of course I don't begrudge it. I'm a good guy. She's having a very human moment in what so far has been a very, it's a book crying out that it is human for a lot of it. Basically saying, I'm human, I have feelings, my emotions, but not really knowing how to show that without just saying it. And it ends this first arc, unlike you said, a very deft bit of storytelling where you bring it all back to this very human moment that snaps right back into focus that as much as Al Simmons has lost his world has also lost him, and that's going to be a factor in the story moving forward that becomes one of the more interesting and mature themes throughout, is that balance of humanity through what Spawn has lost, that balance of humanity of what Spawn has lost, and the way his quest to regain it takes him further and further away from it by necessity.
Yeah, I think when I first read this arc, I've read it a few times now, but when I first read this arc, I was like, the rule of cool stuff is cool. I get it. And then the Wanda stuff, I don't know if it's hitting for me. And kind of in my last read through is when it clicked. And also in engaging more with Todd, I guess really as a public figure, right? I don't know the guy. I've never interviewed him one-on-one. But in sort of watching interviews and reading interviews and kind of listening to the way he speaks about the things that he cares about, it kind of put a different lens on this for me, where it's like what you said, Al specifically is crying out about his humanity, but there's a flip side to that as well. And it does exist within the book. It just does take Todd kind of going through a little bit of scriptwriter 101 of all right, here's your save the cat moment. It's here's your this, here's your that. And it's well, you don't have to keep doing that. Let's get going. Because in a weird way, Wanda and Al actually figuring out what's going on is the most compelling part of the book. I don't really understand what's going on with Malebolgia outside of war for good and evil, heaven and hell, whatever. That stuff's never as important in a book.
It's like the X-Files, where that larger mythos is important because it drives the story, and some of the things that people love about that show and that story are necessitated by that. But the thing that makes that work is the human relationship at the core of it between Mulder and Scully. And I think that's the Sam and Diane, Mulder and Scully, moonlighting kind of thing that he's trying to find by having Wanda and Al separated and still thinking of each other. But it does take 4 issues from the opening page of him being like, "Why did I do?
What did I
Why did
do?
I
Why did I
become
do it?
Spawn? Why did I choose to become
I,
Spawn?"
the
To
the
his
thing
wife being like, "I sure miss my husband."
the thing I'd relate it to in a way is a little bit of where the relationship in general, and to bring it back to Spider-Man a little bit, is it is kind of where we leave Peter and MJ for that
Oh
era
yeah,
for Todd. They are kind of they're married at that point, like, and
and
what's
you
interesting
saying that
is
gives me a thought. But go ahead.
I wonder if your thought is similar to mine. There's a reason that Brand New Day happens and One More Day happens. And it's because it gives the same sort of stakes to the story that this does. It took a lot longer to get there, and everybody can bitch about it. But like the fact that that's in the story and people cared about it meant you did something right. And I will relate that directly to Spawn and the letters column, the spawning ground, as it were. The kind of amazing thing about having all these issues in front of me is getting to read this. And you go from issue 1, Todd is still full of piss and vinegar. He is doing what he wants. He's making his book. And you watch that change as he's had to dive into this book, and the book is him. And he learns more and more about these characters, and I suspect learns more about himself and his
More
own
about his
feelings.
abilities and his craft too.
Yeah. But so he says in the first issue doesn't really have a letters column. It just has a big essay from him. He's going on about all the companies and how they didn't let other creatives do their thing. And he's like, to tell you the truth, it would have been far easier to stick with Spider-Man, collect a big check, fly to conventions, and act like a big shot. Instead, I'm turning my back on a sure thing for some, perhaps an unattainable goal. My wife and I have a new daughter, and I know that because I'm following my heart, I will be a better husband and father. No amount of money could buy me that. Also, I'd like to present a nice atmosphere that I work in to my daughter so she isn't turned off by the whole comic process. Someday I hope she'll be proud of me instead of thinking I'm getting the shaft. Now is the time for me to sink or swim. No one to blame but myself. The future has never excited me more. I can draw cool characters, monsters, silent issues, wordy issues. As a matter of fact, no issues if I don't want to. And better than all that, I don't have to answer to anyone. Sound egotistical? Call it what you will. Doing what I want, when I want, where I want. I call it exciting as hell.
So I think that's so interesting because, again, you look at Spawn as a character is a man alone. He's a guy who has nothing, no safety net. The only thing he has is this hellish apparatus. And I think that's interesting. And I think that kind of parallels, again, a lot of his thoughts and feelings, whether he was intentionally sitting down at the page and going, I'm going to draw my emotions today, or it's just something that's coming out and how he's processing what his ideal vision of a hero is. So the thing that I think is interesting is he did this right after coming off of Spider-Man, and there's almost a refracted vision of Spawn as a sequel to Spider-Man. Like, what if Peter Parker died? You know what I mean? And there's MJ moving on with a kid and a safe life. So there is, again, I don't think that Todd McFarlane was like, I'm going to do a Spider-Man riff, but I think that again, he's taking from things he's drawn before. We joked a little bit that Todd McFarlane has only ever drawn Spawn. His entire career in comics, he has only ever drawn Spawn. And some of that is evident in the way that he twisted some of the shapes of Spider-Man's body and his costume and his webs to fit his vision. Some of it is evident in the way that he also sets up Spawn as a total departure from what his last work was. A total departure of the kind of hero and the kind of story it is.
Although in a way, Al and Peter do have something in common, in which like Al Simmons has the old Parker luck.
Absolutely.
Right? He passes out at inopportune times. He made a bad deal. He, he can't get what he wants, no matter what. And actually, it's again, I don't remember the timeline for. I think MJ has a miscarriage. right?
Yeah,
Doesn't she?
there's there yes, it more or less that's a
It's
TLDR.
yeah. I mean, that's
And because like partially because of Spider-Man's
yeah. It's like because of
radioactive
him.
cum.
But like, there's that too, right? It's the thing that Peter can't give MJ for whatever reason. I realize
Exactly.
Renew Your Vows exists now and whatever.
No, for sure, but at the time, I think it's something again interesting. Maybe it is a little bit of a direct response to Spider-Man. The more we talk about it in that way, and in terms of him saying, well, like some of this is going to be different. He's got the symbiote costume. It almost feels like this is the turning point from like if Peter Parker had fully become Venom, and that may have been a starting point. I don't know. That's purely just me saying like there is a literary parallel here. I'm not gonna put that on this, but knowing the way Todd McFarlane draws from his own life, from his own experiences, and even the way his work and his personality are inextricable, I think that's entirely possible. And I think that is a theme that is going to come up more and more as we go on through these hundreds of issues of Spawn. And the other thing about that is we have a wealth of both personal experiences to draw from in terms of our experiences relating to Spawn and to Todd McFarlane as a character, a creator, and a person in the same industry as me and Pierce. And we have a wealth of resources of interviews he's done, of essays he's written. There are through lines that come up again and again and again through the process of creating Spawn, turning it into a huge, massive franchise, a massive downfall back to the bottom of basically, again, where we were talking about where it's just static on the comic shelves, to a period where once again Spawn 300 sold the most comics, like it was a record-breaking sales issue. And there's just something interesting about Todd McFarlane always painting himself as a perpetual underdog against these big companies, even when he's kind of embodying aspects of them that are not great, and pitching himself as a singular standalone hero, even among other singular standalone heroes. I think that's just so fascinating how that the man is inextricable from the comic, is inextricable from the narrative of the life of the story. And that's what makes Spawn, even through its flaws and even through the very somewhat cliche aspects of it that embody these 90s, tropes and some of the best and worst of 90s excess. I think that's what makes it interesting as a document of a career, of a person, of a personality, and of the values and creative necessities and drives of Todd McFarlane to change the industry for himself and by extension others, somewhat successfully, somewhat not successfully. And I think that's going to be an extremely interesting conversation as we continue talking about Spawn past these first issues, which we've already spent over 2 hours talking about.
Yeah, this has been a long one, and maybe we rethink 4-issue arcs in the future. But
yeah, well, maybe
but
we'll
I think
break
we
this
also
up or something. But
we had a lot of table setting to do, right? So, and I think a long episode's okay, right? But for the first one, if they're listening this long, then we probably got them for the second one, right? But I started reading Spawn a few years ago because I wanted to figure out what about this character kept this guy going. And I think in doing so and finding the kind of twisted knots of continuity along the way and the ways that it relates to his life, I just find it so exciting because I think we find so many creators on long runs, right, of books. I mean, we're at the point now where he's been working on Spawn for almost twice as long as Claremont worked on X-Men,
most
for that
of our lives.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? This has just been a mainstay in our lives, and we're on the verge of a new movie, and he's doing DC toys now, and it's not Sisyphusian because he no matter I can't explain it. He's a man who no matter what, when the rock rolls back down the hill for whatever reason,
he rides on it.
He pushes it back up twice as high.
Yeah.
Like he builds the mountain higher and just pushes it up twice as high. And I'm so excited to kind of dig into that. I'm excited to dig into that with you And I'm also excited to sort of hear from anybody listening what their relationship with this stuff is. We can be reached at spawnographypod@gmail.com. So, let us know. And along the way, the hope for the show is not just to dig into the books, but to speak with the people that have been affected by it, who have worked on this book, to the people who've worked on the TV show and the movie and whatever,
It's a whole
because
empire and franchise of media at this point.
And like you said, it's something that is just as recognizable as Spider-Man or Batman, which granted, he does just kind of look like both of them, but
Yeah.
There's
parallels of that in like Robert Kirkman with Invincible, with Spider-Man meets Superman. Kirkman being almost a protege to McFarlane. We'll talk about that at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it has been 2.5 hours.
Yes.
So I think this is where we stop. Like I said, everybody listening, thank you so much. This has been episode 1 of Spawnography. We've been your spawnographers.
Yes. My name is George Marston. My pronouns are they, or them, or she, or her. And you can find me in my rare social media appearances everywhere at Crypt Trash. I'm
Pierce. We didn't do pronouns up at the top, but we should have.
Oh, yeah.
I'm they, them as well. And you can find me at PE Lightning, wherever social media is. You can find Spawnography Podcast at Spawnography Pod on Twitter or whatever it is now. But We'll move to the other sites, whatever replaces it. At some point, we're not on Facebook because who cares about that? But rate and review, subscribe, wherever podcasts can be found. And thanks a lot for your time. There's not like a Make Mine Marvel for Spawn. I wish there was.
No, there's not. For Todd so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Spawn.
I think that's good. All right. Later, y'all.
Spawn!